Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Industrial Transformation Forum, and specific to this session, which is around Asia Pacific supply chains, resilient or not, and what are the gaps, issues, and opportunities. I'm Ashish. I'll be moderating the session today on behalf of the entire team, including our panelists. I am from BCG, Boston Consulting Group, and I'm Global Program Manager for their supply chain practice. We also have a great panelist here, Mr. Cohen, who is VP Spark Manufacturing and AI from Micron Technology. We have Mr. Pierre, Digital Head for Vaccine Facility for Sanofi, and Mr. Kiwi from Chable, who is Vice President Supply Chain Management. So I welcome you all to this great session and look forward to a great discussion today. How are all you doing today?
Thank you, Ashish. Good afternoon. Doing well.
Hello, Ashish. I'm fine. Thank you for the introduction.
Great intro. Great to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Great. So let's directly jump into today's hot topic, which is, are Asia Pacific supply chains more resilient? Let me set up the context and let me get everyone excited about the topic. We have been hearing about supply chains and especially the resiliency in supply chain from last 18 or 20 months or so quite a lot. Due to this pandemic, which is going on and still prevalent in some part of the world. So from the experts, I would like to know what actually you have seen in the last 18, 20 months in resilient supply chain. How would you actually define it in your respective industries, respective companies, respective clients? What are the traits of resilient supply chain? And especially what would be great to hear from all of you is pre-COVID and present day situation, what has changed in resiliency in supply chain? So maybe I'll go by the order appearing in my laptop. So Mr. Pierre, over to you.
Okay, so thank you, Ashish, for the first question. Very nice and very good question. Before to enter to the detail, so from Sanofi Pasteur, which is, I would say, the vaccine division of Sanofi, what is important first as an introduction, this is to maybe give you what is very atypical, I can say, for the vaccine world before to enter to your question. So the lead time for manufacturing a vaccine is quite important. You have to know that the vaccine that you found now on the market were manufactured between 2 to 3 years ago. So on the vaccine, on the COVID situation, you can understand that this is, I would say, quite a challenge for us because it was something that we cannot predict in advance. So that's the number one. The number two, in terms of, I would say, aspect to take into consideration is the demand is highly variable demand. So this is very difficult to predict in advance. So this is why I put this context first to answer to your question. The second part of the answer is linked to the, I would say, COVID situation. So I think that we faced some, like my colleague will probably explain just after, we faced all the semi-shift for the raw material. We have some very particular raw materials that we have probably as mono sourcing for some suppliers, so that's difficult on that situation, especially because the lockdown situation were not the same country by country, so we have also to adapt to that part. And this is still the case, and by the way, this is not a finish. So depending on some country, we can see that some peak restarting here and here. So we have to manage and to follow, I would say, constantly the rules. And the number two is the shipment issues that we faced and we are still facing. For some countries, and also the price depending on those shipments. So for me, that's in the vaccine world. That's what I would like to emphasize: raw materials and the shipment issue as I would say the main reason.
That's indeed great points, Pierre. And what I really like about it, and when I talk to my clients from BCG side, they exactly say most of these things that you just talked about. So high demand variability, issues with the suppliers, and these form a great area of resilient supply chain, and including the shipment issues that you just mentioned. Coming to you, Mr. Cohen, about the resilient supply chain traits definition per you.
Yeah, I think when I think about resilient supply chain, to me, it's all about how do you keep meeting your customer requirements in a cost-effective way in a world that has completely changed, right? And the change is really the level of variability and unpredictability in terms of demand and supply. I mean, if you just think of the whole pandemic in terms of demand, I look at the sector Micron plays in, right? Like a semiconductor sector. I mean, we've seen massive shifts in terms of demand. I mean, think of it, all of a sudden we moved online, right? Like we all kind of got our kids into online education, and so we all had to go buy laptops for our kids, etc. So massive shifts in terms of demand that happened, combined then with big challenges in terms of supply, right? I mean, obviously our own manufacturing and how do we keep that running? We were quite lucky in terms of being considered as a critical sector to be able in all of the countries that we are operating to be continuing to produce at the full capacity, obviously with a lot of challenges in there in making sure that we have the right materials that get shipped to us from all of our suppliers, making sure that all of our workforce is able to actually be on site. So, a lot of variability, and I think that is just going to be a constant going forward. Now, but whether it's a pandemic, whether it's environmental challenges, whether it's political, I think that is a constant that we're going to see, and everything to do with, how can we then respond to that from a supply chain perspective to still meet our demand in that new world? To me, a lot has to do with kind of the underlying technology, right? And I think what we've seen is companies that were prepared already before COVID in terms of adoption of new I4.0 technologies, they've actually really benefited from that during the pandemic. Others that were less prepared have had to scramble and have had actually to kind of ramp up very, very quickly just to be able to continue the operations. And I think that is something that will stay, right? I think it's a fantastic lesson in how fast we've actually been able to move online. Think of it from a supply chain perspective. All of a sudden, we are doing our virtual control tower meetings as if we were always doing that before, or like new technologies that previously were more kind of proof of concept type of things. Think, for example, on augmented reality. That we were doing quite a bit of work before in terms of proof of concepts, but all of a sudden that became a must in order to get new tools installed in our sites, or getting kind of remote assistance in terms of troubleshooting of our equipment, just because our equipment suppliers were not able to kind of come on site anymore. So I think there's a lot of learnings from a technology perspective that helped us to cope with that. And I think much more of that is needed looking forward in terms of how do we keep meeting that demand in a world where the demand and the supply can be very volatile.
Great points. And what I really like to take, like two things that you just mentioned, that disruptions are going to be there in the industry, be it pandemic today and coming in the next 2 years. It may be anything that we have not foreseen. So that's one thing that's a great message. And the second thing which I really liked about your message is the digital native companies, or companies who have invested earlier in the digital technology and changing landscape, they had slightly better edge when the disruptions happened. And BCG, we did this recent survey, and this is exactly the outcome that we foresaw. That companies who have invested in digital and technology 2 years back, versus companies who have started investing it once the pandemic happened. Of course, they did cope up, or they are coping up, but the delta that we have seen in terms of like customer satisfaction, demand variability, speed, agility, I mean, it's the massive shift. So these are the sort of key messages I take, and which are like great points. So thank you, Mr. Cohen. Mr. Kiwi, to you.
Right, so I'm going to build a little bit of context about JBL as a company. So we are a manufacturing solutions company. So today JBL operates across 30 countries We have more than 100 sites, and on a daily basis, we're interacting with 27,000 suppliers globally. So, from our perspective, right, whether it's pre-COVID or post-COVID, resiliency in the supply chain is a big part of what we do. So the way we look at resiliency, I tend to look at it in two parts, right? The first part is how elastic is your supply chain, right? And the second part would be, how responsive it is. So I'm going to give a bit of clarification. So when we talk about how elastic the supply chain is, right? To me, we are looking at the fundamental supply chain design. So remember, at least in our world, there is a physical aspect to the supply chain design. And the agility of the supply chain, the responsiveness of the supply chain is actually bounded the constraints that is set upon by this design. So some of the things, in our world at least, when we talk about, sole source and single source component dependency, we talk about technology life cycle of the components, manufacturing nodes, processes that we are designing inside our products or we are, manufacturing, processing complexity, locations, where do we build, logistic constraints and whatnot. These are all aspects in the supply chain design that will create a physical aspect on how flexible that supply chain can be. So these are extremely, extremely important thing when we look at, in our supply chain design, regardless whether it's pre-COVID or the current situation. So that's one part of it, right? The second part of it, from a responsiveness standpoint, to me, the definition is that how responsive your supply chain can be once a disruption happens. So this involves, developing specific strategies, implementing specific strategies that deals with the limitations of the physical constraints, right? The discussions around nearshoring versus, offshoring, the discussions around, how much a role that inventory is going to play in disruptions like this. So all this trade-off discussions, all this analysis on what do we need to do to have strategies in place so that we are able to create a better responsiveness of the supply chain when the disruptions occurs. These are all the things that's going to be extremely, extremely important, regardless of how you slice and dice the supply chain resiliency, formula. So everything that I talked about, it needs to get encompasses with advanced planning, advanced demand planning, very specific inventory strategies so that we address the manufacturing velocity, including in and outbound logistics. So from a JBL perspective, we take a pretty holistic view when we talk about supply chain resiliency.
That's great. And I really liked it. And BCG being a strategy company, I completely echo what you just said. Supply chain resiliency in a COVID kind of a situation, it's a disruption, right? And you cannot, whatever we did in the COVID situation, that was more reactive. So, improving your demand forecasting, improving customer satisfaction, maintaining your inventory level, all these were sudden. And a lot of these were the reactive situation. What I really liked about Jabil's approach here is making it as part of supply chain strategy. So while designing the supply chain, while designing your inventory planning, your warehouses, your location, your supplier identification, your IBP process, integrated business planning process, you keep supply chain resiliency in mind. I think that's super important, and that's what in last close to 2 years now we have been also advising to our clients, and we have seen also massive success. So great point of views, gentlemen here. So customer service, supplier integration or supplier volatility, resiliency has to be part of your supply chain strategy. The digital investments, all these are some of the sort of key takeaways. I would just like to summarize it for our audience for this particular question. So I think this is a great segue for my next sort of segue to the next chapter of this discussion, which is around Asia Pacific supply chain and how resilient it is. Considering we have Pierre, you are managing the Sanofi from European perspective, and you have also great experience in the global supply chain. I would like to hear from you that what has been your experience towards European/global supply chain versus Asia Pacific supply chain. Our Asia Pacific supply chains are really resilient. What is the contrast that you would like to draw between global versus Asia Pacific supply chain, considering Asia Pacific has some of the rapidly developing economies? Feel free to elaborate, give examples, data, facts in your experience. Yeah.
So thank you, Ashish, again for the good question. Very happy here to bring, I would say, the global perspective, especially coming from Europe and North America. So the main, I would say, point I would like to emphasize is during the COVID situation is everything to the geopolitics aspect. What I mean by the geopolitics is that as a global company, it was important for us to look at each different rules that all the government put in place. And on the pharma world, especially for the vaccine world, you have to know that for some country, sometimes the plant is not piloting anymore by us. The plant is piloting directly by the governments. They have the hands on the plant if it's needed. So we have to take that into account in the big equation because this is really important to, I would say, anticipate this kind of move. The other one is also, I would like just to take the parallel with the mask example. The mask example was a very good one. We have a huge demand once upon a time to be sure that everybody is I would say on demand tackle from the country, and that part was very difficult to manage. We see the peak of activity coming from China, coming from India, and all the other country was I would say fighting to have their demand. So that's the same aspect somewhere from the vaccine world as well. The other point I would like also to emphasize for that supply chain linked still with the geopolitics is the demand to restart after the COVID. You never know when will be the end of the crisis, depending on the country. So therefore, you cannot anticipate what will be the demand. For example, the travelers for US just restarting yesterday. So this is, I would say, the restart for traveling, and how you can anticipate in when a country will, I would say, stop the travel ban. And from that, it is an impact directly to the demand of the vaccine to be sure that you have the product on the market at the right time. So it was very difficult to manage that part from a global point of view. And this is where the resilience sometimes of Europe versus North America versus Asia Pacific is also quite interesting to manage.
That's a great perspective. And a follow-up question here, Pierre, on this. Asia Pacific supply chains usually are tricky. When I say tricky, I mean we have various types of economies within Asia Pacific region. So we have ANZ as a separate economy. We have Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, of course Indian subcontinent, and then of course Japan, Korea, and China kind of economies as well. So in a quick snapshot that you would like to suggest that what some of the rapidly developing economy like China and Japan, I mean, Japan, of course, is already developed economy, these should do or do not do in order to make more resilient supply chain? I mean, what they're doing better, which other global supply chains can learn from, or any other contrast that you would like to draw? My question is, so basically global trade kind of a situation, right? So we have China, massive supplier base in China, and if any supplier default happens in China, it impacts massive global supply chain. So any two cents that you would like to share to Asia Pacific supply chain related things in terms of resiliency in supply chain?
So my 2 cents, Ashish, to try to answer your question, I will take the sustainability, I would say, aspect as number one. And for me, we are now entering a new world where we all have to take care about, I would say, the planets. And this is where I should recommend from all the Asia Pacific, I would say, supplier in this global environment to take care about the sustainability. How we can avoid, I would say, some product to do 2 or 3 times around the globe to finish to one supplier. That's for me the number one, I would say, answer to your question. How we can make a world better still resilient in terms of supply chain, but still sustainable for the long term, and not to, I would say, just not generate, I would say, materials and to travel around the world. That's for me the number one advice I should recommend to Asia Pacific.
That's indeed a very another hot topic in supply chain segment. I would say, of course, the resilient supply chain. There is a sustainable supply chain. So great point, Pierre, and thank you for combining both the topic and making our audience also like know that while sustainability, while resiliency is in supply chain is important, but there is a lot that we can do in the sustainable supply chain. So thank you for your views on this. Great. Now, my question to Mr. Cohen, and I was waiting for this question especially to ask you, Cohen, that semiconductors and silicon chips shortage across the world is disrupting big time, not only the supply chain, but entire the operations of manufacturing company, high-tech companies, you name it, and people have, companies have suffered from it. I have like at least 3 clients presently who are sort of struggling with the semiconductor crisis. 2 questions to you. Number 1, as a consumer of semiconductor chips and technology, how would you comment that you are navigating through this massive disruption? So that's question number 1. Question number 2, you're also supplier or sort of pioneer in semiconductor technology because your products are like that. How would you see that this disruption, how long it may last, or any other 2 cents that you can give to our audience navigating through this crisis in the coming days?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right pointing out that it is definitely in the news, right? The overall or on top of mind of a lot of supply chain professionals. I mean, I think first of all, I mean, many of us will have heard in the news as well, kind of the stories around car manufacturers, for example, that having to stop their production, right? Just because of shortages of semiconductor components. I think something important to note is that as such, the cost of the semiconductor component might be very small compared to the overall cost of a car. So just understanding that small component missing can really halt your production and can have massive impacts overall, I think is already a first takeaway, right? Like of kind of where should you focus when you just think from supply chain resiliency. It is not just on your big spend category optimization around that one and making sure your second source is there, but truly understanding not just from your direct supply, but from your suppliers, where could be these smaller points of challenges in the supply chain, I think is a very important piece. But just to take a step back, like why did we got into this situation in the semicon industry? I think one piece of it is obviously during COVID, you had shifts of demand, right? You all of a sudden had like spikes in demand on, say, for example, PC and cloud, because we all went to work online. The other piece of it is that obviously as we now open up economies again, we see that shift coming then in other industries. But obviously that capacity is a finite capacity. It takes multiple years in the semicon industry and multi-billion type of investments to actually add capacity in the overall supply chain. So that is kind of the underlying challenge, obviously, that we are facing. Now, I think one important thing to note is that the shortage is not so much across all of semicon. Like within semicon, obviously a very big segment, but there's many subsegments in there. Micron itself, we're focused on memory and storage products. So in our segment around memory and storage, there isn't kind of a crunch in terms of capacity. There's a couple of things I feel like we've done really well, and I think that is something important in terms of learnings of kind of how should companies go about it. I think one is important because we have these long investment cycles, because it does take a lot of time to actually add capacity, is to truly be able to kind of build resiliency into your supply chain network upfront. When we look at our assembly and test network, for example, we do make sure that we have a good balance between what we internally are able to kind of produce, plus then also work with our subcontractors. So we are able to kind of balance what we do in-house versus what we outsource. And at the same time, we build it in such a way that being able to produce it in multiple locations, again, so that if events happen in one location, we're able to shift it to other locations. So that's more on kind of like where do we put our investments and how do we put these investments such that we have that flexibility, knowing that we will have these spikes in demand and kind of variability in kind of supply. How do we go about that? The other piece is really more the shorter term, right? Like, and how do we handle that, and how do we make sure that we maximize the capacity that we have? And I feel like we've done a really good job around implementing our i4.0 technologies, but I think there's even more kind of opportunity there across the entire industry. Obviously, in throughput maximization, higher yields, etc., is a very obvious one where a lot of people can focus on, and where a lot of benefits can be found. But also thinking from a supply chain perspective, in how we move our planning much more to forward-looking, right? Like, instead of being very good in reacting very fast when something happens, how do we run more scenarios? How do we look more forward and understand like where these risks are? And based on that, instruct our team members what needs to be done. So much more prescriptive in what we can do about it, rather than kind of being really good in reactive. Because the moment you start reacting, everybody else in the industry reacts as well, and you kind of get kind of an aggravated effect of it. So to me, overall, these are the core areas. So how long will the situation take? I mean, it's in reality, this is all linked to how much time does it take to add more capacity in the network, right? Like that, and these are multi-year type of investments. There is a lot of investments that happen around the world, just because of the understanding that semicon is a critical sector overall to a lot of, any electronics device that you use on a day-to-day will have semicon components in there. But yeah, it is something that does take time to actually build that right capacity.
No, that's great. And one chip can halt your production line, and I completely agree with it. I mean, I remember my automotive days where manufacturing lines stopped due to small plastic caps that we used to, put some fuel injectors in. So we have seen line stoppage due to such a small component. We tend to overbuy ourselves, high capacity item or high investment raw material. But this is the reality of today's supply chain. Quick follow-up question. And to you, of course, Koen, but also Pierre, Kiwi, please chime in and suggest your views as well here. Risk and resiliency. Of course, resilient supply chain is a capability. Risk is a starting point of building a resilient supply chain. That's how I have seen it with my previous experience and with my clients today. Any quick 1 or 2 cents on the risk identification part for our audience? And what I mean by risk is here, risk can be a geopolitical kind of risk that you just mentioned a while back, Pierre and Koen. It can be digital and technology. It can be supply chain design. It can be supplier, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Any quick 2 cent on the risk part alone, that how to identify the risk. I know it's a broad question, but something with your experience, that what are the areas one should consider while identifying risk in supply chain, so that if you give me 2 weeks to assess your supply chain, these are the things I'm going to assess, and after 2 weeks, probably these are the 2 or 3 or 5 high critical items I would like to address in your supply chain in order to make your supply chain more resilient. So that's my sort of articulation of the question that I wanted to ask. All 3 of you, feel free to add your views.
Well, I can add maybe one, and I'll pass on to other ones. I mean, one area to just think about is the risk. We typically talk about it of the quite obvious ones, right? Like we think about kind of like some environmental event happens, so those are very well known. But I think one other area to really look at is really understanding your supply markets. Like, how is the supply demand balance within kind of each of your material categories that you're procuring from? Because those, and understanding how much time it does take, for example, to add additional capacity into these markets. These are more difficult to understand, these pockets of risks, but I think that's kind of like where a lot of focus needs to be on these better understanding of kind of supply market dynamics and focusing your attention there on the hidden risks that are there in your direct suppliers, but also the suppliers of your direct suppliers.
So let me add on to what Cohen has mentioned, right? I think from my perspective, right, when you talk about, so JB builds product, from a product's perspective, right, once a product is designed and built, the inherent risk it's already designed into the product. The cost of qualification, requalification often are very expensive and it's hard to do. So, when we talk about risk management, I think it's extremely important that supply chain becomes a part of the decision-making process upfront when you're talking about developing and designing a new product. The ability for you to understand, the risk that you are designing into your product and ensuring that those are justifiable design risks that you have to undertake, and make sure that you have plans to address those risks as you get into mass production, general availability. Those are critical steps that you have to focus on, right? I think if we ignore the front end, right, we all know that once the product goes into production, the entire supply chain community is living and reacting to the inherent risk that's being designed, and cost of change is extremely expensive. So getting upfront involvement, real considerations about the supply chain risk that's being designed in is absolutely critical when we talk about how do we want to make sure a supply chain is more resilient, and tying that back into the entire risk management perspective.
And Ashish, if I complete what my colleague just explained, in terms of risk management, I should suggest also to work differently, I would say, between the different supplier. This is not anymore, I would say, a customer relationship, but more a partnership into bracket relation with a win-win approach. I think to manage the risk, it could be one of the, I would say, good direction that we have also to think about.
A great point. I mean, like any other strategy company, we also assess supply chain of our client. We diagnose, we design. And this is what we also have been helping our clients with, how early we can detect the risk. We're using technology, we're using right strategies, using right framework. And I mean, you all have covered it very rightly in your responses. And this is a good segue to my another question to Mr. Kiwi. Jabil has been into, it's a highly smart engineering company. Let me put that way, right? It's an engineering-driven company, a lot of digital and technology in place. How would you see the role of digital and technology in making business or supply chain more resilient in last 18-20 months, and of course the path going forward next few years or so, the role of digital and technology making supply chain more resilient?
So let me first start off as the way we look at digital technology, supply chain resiliency. We look at it from people, process, and technology standpoint, right? Again, with 100 sites across 30 countries, 27,000 suppliers we're dealing with. I have, in total in Jabil, 260,000 colleagues that is working the factories, working the supply chain every day. I think first and foremost for us is investment in people, right? We have to make sure that we have the right investment in our people in order for us to drive the innovation, the resiliency, and the partnership across in the supply base. Now, if I look back the last 18, 24 months, right, and I had this benefit of touching a lot of suppliers in my work. I think one of the biggest difference we talk about, how companies has been able to react into in the last 18, 24 months has been, in Jabil, we have a long-standing focus on connectivity and enabling global collaboration. And we do that across a common IT backbone. We do that with a keen eye on the ability for us to scale and the ability for us to focus on cybersecurity. having a framework like this and enabling employees to be able to get comfortable with interacting, working remotely, having access to data for them to continue their work regardless of location, I think is a key enabler for us to have been able to respond the way we have responded in the last 18 months. And I compare that with some of the suppliers that I worked with, especially in the beginning of the pandemic. I think some of those that hasn't really considered some of this basic infrastructure, haven't considered this, hasn't intertwined this in their basic, scaling strategy, are the suppliers that tend to struggle a little bit more, right? And as I look forward, what COVID-19 has taught us is this, right? We all know about shop floor management system. We all talk about advanced planning. I think it's important right now for everybody to look at all the tool sets in all these different areas as an entire ecosystem. So at Javier, when we look at this in three specific categories, if I will, right? We look at it from a visibility standpoint. How do I enhance visibility across my end-to-end supply chain, right? That includes logistics, that includes, order management with my supply base, order confirmation with the supply base, that includes visibility on the shop floor. How do we talk about orchestration within the supply chain, right? Understanding, what is available today, what's going to happen, the ability for us to do predictive analytics around what might happen, a little bit more prescriptive, scenario planning so that we can act based on some of those analytics is extremely important. And the last piece is risk management, which we just talked about, right? How do we actively ensure that we have a way to minimize the risk in the entire supply chain and have a very focused way on how do we reduce that. So those three key areas, right? It is important that we are able to look at those as an ecosystem, leverage the tools and technologies that's available today, right? Edge computing, cloud, 5G, predictive analytics. There's a lot of software companies out there that's providing very good solutions for us to have the ability for us to leverage those solutions and create an ecosystem that will give us the kind of information that's required for us to continue to be a little bit more smarter in the way that we are looking at supply chain resiliency, and that drives the sustainability message as well, right? The ability for us to better predict and understand what we need to do reduces the waste that we see in the entire supply chain. So that's my take.
Great points. Visibility, orchestration, and risk management, and pretty much it summarizes all the landscape of resilient supply chain. So that's a good way of looking into it. Just the interest of time, maybe last very candid question to each of you here. If you have to advise a chief operating officer of a company or a chief supply chain officer or your friends who are in a different leadership cohort in supply chain areas, what are those one or two things that you would like to suggest him or her in order to make their supply chain more resilient? Pierre.
So thank you, Ashish, for the question. I can take a lot of examples, but for the sake of time, I will just focus for one of them. I will look just beyond the supply chain, looking at the manufacturing, I would say, plants, because what we are provided at the raw material will also, I would say, help to foster the manufacturing plants later. And I would take the parallel with the automobile industry. Today, you are taking the same platform for a car to build different type of car. And for the vaccine world, we are doing the same now. So this is a very great, I would say, innovative, flexible, and agile plant that we will, as Sanofi, invest in Singapore to produce a new plant starting this year. So this is why I would like to, I would say, recommend to take the flexible and agile approach also from the manufacturing to be able, if you have a shortage on one given product, to switch very easily to another product.
Coin.
I'll maybe point out two things. Like one is, my role is smart manufacturing, so I have to kind of highlight that one. Invest in technologies up front, right? Like see that as a real differentiator. The investments you make in that now will really help you throughout kind of crisis moments. And I think the second piece of it, and partly linked to technology as well, is our end-to-end visibility in our supply chain. I mean, we've been talking about that for a very long time. But how do you really make that work? And how do you really kind of extend that to multiple tiers in your supply network? I think that's a very important area where we have to change the way of thinking about that, away from imbalance in information gives me power in the negotiation, towards actually that imbalance in information is really a weakness in your supply chain if you don't kind of set that up, because it will drive areas where you have real risk.
Yeah. Lastly, Kiwi to you.
I'll make 2 points, right? First point is that on the component supply base front, right? Again, I'm reinforcing the fact that we have to foster engineering, design, R&D, supply chain collaboration as early in the design cycle as possible, to the extent that we are able to ensure that we have the right solution design in place with consideration of all the risk parameter. It's gonna allow us to be able to have a better solution going forward. And I think the second one would be patience. Where we are today, as far as the supply chain construct globally, is not by accident, right? It has taken many, many years of investments by many companies, to set up where the supply chain is today. Now, COVID-19 has jotted everybody and probably made us rethink of what supply chain design needs to be going forward. And it's going to take, I think it's safe to say that it's going to take us many years to get to where we want to be or where we need to meet. So, patience is important. The ability for us to continue to leverage technologies that's available today with an eye of scalability and cybersecurity is going to be extremely important as we continue to invest in technology to allow us to be a little bit more proactive in the future. So those are the few things that I would say. Thank you.
Great points. I think this was a phenomenal, insightful session. And I'm sure our audience will benefit from this discussion. And thank you, Pierre, Koen, and Kiwi, to share your insightful ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.